And the thing that struck me was the description of hemp being grown around the Hawkesbury in the 1850s. We've supplied materials for 250 plus residential buildings and quite a lot of other tiny buildings. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share some information again at this forum. I have been involved in the industry for a long time. I first got involved in 1999 running agronomic research trials in a place called Wollombi in the Hunter Valley. I'd been to the Mitchell Library in Sydney and found an article in the New South Wales Government Gazette written in 1856 that had identified Wollombi as one of the areas in the Hunter that would be suitable for growing hemp. I was working as a sustainability manager and in education at the time, so I was with Hunter Institute of TAFE at that time and then went on to North Coast. And the thing that struck me was the description of hemp being grown around the Hawkesbury in the 1850s. And the description was about what a climate resilient, using my terminology, climate resilient crop it was. It described hemp going through incredible hailstorms, being knocked over, standing back up again. And it seemed like the crop that we needed for what we are experiencing right now. So that was my introduction, and then, so 1999, planted hemp 10 years prior to it being legalised or commercialised in New South Wales, and in 2000 started building materials research at University of New South Wales and have continued to do research ever since then, most recently an Australian Research Council grant where we did some comparative analysis of hemp cast in place, hemp panels with green infrastructure compared to brick veneer construction, looking at thermals, acoustics, indoor air quality, because that hadn't really been looked at in Australia, and also developing a series of low carbon binders as alternatives to lime as a building material. But the thing that this was actually brought to my attention, this reduction roadmap, when I co-presented with Alistair Flynn, who's going to be talking tomorrow, from Woods Bagot. So we're involved in the UTAS project. And he spoke about the reduction roadmap. So there's been a Danish reduction roadmap, and this is the Australian reduction roadmap that has come from that. And it's just got some fairly staggering figures. And given that I think that a lot of people in this room are involved in the hemp industry because we do think that it's an answer, we do think that there is potential for solutions through hemp. I think we have to be really realistic about how good that solution has to be and how tight we have to be in how we manage this industry. You know, and I will mention later that every hectare of hemp that is planted that is unsuccessful has got a carbon footprint, because there's fertiliser runoff and all of the rest of those sorts of things that are associated with it. So despite the fact that we're working with a phenomenal plant with a 6,000-year history, documented history in China, we still have to be careful about how we manage this plant and really strive to do it as well as we possibly can. And that probably does require some quite confronting conversations because, as Bob says, the communication has not been good enough yet. The knowledge hasn't been shared well enough. So just looking at these figures, if we look at the current national emissions, 574 million tonnes of carbon, and where do we need to get to be in the safe operating space, is 8.23 million tonnes. So that's a really, really long way to go. And really we don't need to look at this in detail. What happens in the next 10 years is what it's all about, and if any people have future generations connected to them here, which I certainly do, then there's really, really serious work to happen in a very, very short time frame. So if we talk about planetary boundaries, what we can see on the left is where we were in 2009, and if we look over there at 2023, what we can see is the impacts that we're having on the ecosystem on every kind of level. So Australian Hemp Masonry, just what has been our involvement, by 2009 it was commercial in New South Wales, and we did our first residential build in 2009. We've supplied materials for 250 plus residential buildings and quite a lot of other tiny buildings. I think, well, we have been the predominant manufacturer of binder and of company involved in the building industry. We've supplied to a whole lot of small composting toilets in a whole lot of sites, you know. So there have been occasions where I've Marrickville, Green, public community garden. There's a tiny pokey little composting toilet there, which won an award. But nevertheless, the idea was that we have to go everywhere where we can seed an idea, where we can introduce this material to a group of people and get a conversation going. We're delivering training, or we've been delivering training in Australia since 2011, and more recently in New Zealand, as Richard mentioned. We also have 3 residential builds in New Zealand. It wasn't our intention to be a supplier into New Zealand, but it was again for us about seeding an idea. We have 6 commercial projects in Australia, 4 in New South Wales, the Byron Steiner School Innovation Centre, the Lithgow Women's Shed, the Truffle Barn and an organic garlic processing facility. In Victoria, the Powerhouse Place project, which won a whole swag of awards last year, which was fantastic to see, and Anna Maskeel from Public Realm Lab will be talking about that project tomorrow. And then Tasmania, the UTAS refurbishment of the forestry building in Hobart, which is just an incredibly exciting opportunity, because I guess one of the obstacles to the hemp industry moving forward was the timber industry, if we go back to Prohibition. And so to see this little turnaround happening and to see timber being used so much more carefully in that building, and adaptive reuse, so the keeping of everything that is there and then adding hemp into the equation, which is the way that we need to go forward. We need to be storing hemp in whatever we can, because it is such a phenomenal opportunity for carbon storage. So what do? We coordinate and connect with architects. We work with regional hemp suppliers, so we're really trying to pull back that footprint. Initially, all of the builds that we supplied to came out of New South Wales, but our commitment to ourselves as a small company was that we were going to regionalise that, and we have certainly moved quite a long way in the last 2 or 3 years in that direction of getting regional supply for regional builds. We manufacture in Sydney a lime binder for hempcrete and hemp lime renders, and we run workshops and educate. So Australia has the largest per capita housing footprint globally. The average floor area of a new dwelling is 186 square metres, so the most common Australian type. The detached house averages 232 square metres, the largest in the world. So our current housing emissions, 461.8 carbon equivalent kilos per square metre, needs to reduce to 6.63 carbon equivalent kilos to be within the safe operating space. So if Australia's plans for new housing, if delivered business as usual, so using conventional materials, would consume around 200% of our national emissions budget for everything, not just for construction, but for everything. So we obviously can't proceed in that way. At the same time, most Australians can't afford a new home. What options are identified in the reduction roadmap? Reducing the house size back to what we used to live in the 1970s, when we had much bigger households, 120 square metres. Reducing the number of homes built, reducing the size as well as the number of new homes, and making better use of the existing housing space. If we actually did that, we'd have a little bit of wriggle room in the carbon budget. Where are the opportunities for hemp construction? Well, I believe that there are huge opportunities, and this isn't meant to be a kind of depressing presentation about how hemp, there's no opportunity for everybody. There is opportunity. It's a fantastic opportunity, but we really have to get all of our ducks in a row across farming and look at efficiencies in every level of it. Huge opportunity in the 10 million or 80% of Australia's 10 million homes that have 1 or less than 2-star energy efficiency currently. So incredible opportunity there in retrofitting, and still an opportunity there in new building. But probably what we need to be doing is really looking at smaller buildings and looking at how we can retrofit. Where are all of these solutions? But yes, some substantial carbon storage, whether it's in new builds, adaptive reuse, or retrofitting projects. So a couple of challenges. And Bob referred to these as well, that it's very, very difficult to put hemp into the construction industry at a competitive rate when farmers are not able to sell their co-products, and I use the term co-products as well because they are co-products. There is very little waste in there, very minimal. But we need help to get those other co-products into markets, and it hasn't been the focus either for the industry itself, nor have we had the government leadership that I would have hoped in a way that we would have had. I was part of the New South Wales Hemp Industry Task Force, and there we talked about, there's subsidies overseas for farmers and things like that. We don't have any of those things. How can government help us to get those co-products into markets? And in the end, after the discussion about subsidies, I said, subsidies are interesting things because we subsidise the timber industry and we subsidise the sugar industry. I know that we might not call it subsidies, but we can't subsidise. Perhaps it can be through government procurement. And I sort of flippantly said, well, if the government just mandated that 1 kilo of every erosion control log that is sitting on the side of the road actually included hemp bast fibre, we would have an industry. Because that's such a huge buy. And that is what we need. We need government support for substitution. How come Visy is importing, in South Australia, is importing sawdust from China to go into their products, and yet we can't get a look in? And I realise that there need to be economies, and yes, that can't be the primary market for a farmer, but if a farmer can't sell his herd for that because it wasn't a good crop, then he should be able to sell his herd or his short bast or his whatever into another industry where we are buying feedstock in from other countries to make that work. We really have to have a look at those things. The other issue that is a challenge, and it's certainly been a challenge for me because I've bought an amazing assortment of hemp bales over the years in looking for suitable hemp for building materials. We have abundant herd available for the current rate of hemp construction, so we don't actually have a shortage at the moment. In fact, there are a lot of farmers sitting with a lot of bales on their property because there's been a bit of a slump in building across the board, particularly this year with cost of living crisis, etc. But not all the herd that is being produced for building is building grade herd. And Bob's point about that the manufacturer is actually the person who is the buyer, that the farmer needs to communicate with the manufacturer, and the manufacturer needs to be able to say what it is that they need. And some things that have been really lacking that we are working on now as an industry, and I call these the measures that could shift this balance. I hope yours is not as squashed up it is. Continue work on standards for herd for construction. Establish a traceability and trading platform to quantify production and record uptake of materials. This could also potentially inform industries outside the hemp industry about availability of feedstocks and trigger substitution. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because I've had some involvement in work with Winter Nevers, who's going to be talking later on in this forum as well. Specifications for any herd products where they are known should be collated and shared by the primary hemp organisations to any of their members. So I guess the point I'm making here, and I don't mean it as criticism, but rather than just encouraging more and more farmers to plant, make sure farmers don't plant if they don't know exactly what the market is that they're planting for, unless they're swimming in money and they can afford to burn a few crops and not think twice about it. But there aren't many farmers that I've met who are like that. But other than that, the industry organisations, I believe, are beholden to outline those risks and to point anybody who's interested to where there are standards, and there are standards. So we don't have Australian standards yet, but I've shared the French standards for European hemp and what it is that is a non-compliant particle. That's available through all of the organisations. So really, it's very, very important that when somebody comes in and approaches the industry and says, I'm really interested in hemp farming, give them as much information as you possibly can. Forget about ownership of knowledge and whether your membership level is high enough. And I don't even know whether these things exist, so I'm not saying that as commentary on the organisations. I'm just saying that I believe the organisations need to be really, really proactive in being upfront with people and saying, hey, this is a huge risk, or these are your risks, or, go over here and have a look at where these standards might be. Industry organisations marketing hemp feedstocks to potential larger buyers for substitution. And the reason why I say industry organisations perhaps looking at this issue is because the average person who's on the ground, whether they're a farmer or whether they're working on carbon or whether they're working with building materials, can see the dilemma but don't necessarily have the time to go and phone Visi and say, hey, I'd like an appointment. It's actually got nothing to do with my business in a sense. And it's not that it does, but it doesn't. It's just simply the energy of the time isn't there if you're trying to be in the industry to also be that marketer of everything and every aspect of the crop. And yet we all know that every aspect of the crop has to be used, because if it's not locked up in a building for carbon or not locked up, then it's actually emitting emissions. If it's sitting on your farm rotting, in a way, that's not a helpful thing. Imports of subsidised herd need to be discouraged. And those not actually involved in construction step back from public commentary about all Australian herd being substandard, because it simply isn't all substandard. We're the people who are the buyers, and I can assure you that not all herd is substandard. At the same time, we've got people importing from a subsidised country, importing herd into Australia and pushing that into the building market, and really, really anti-competitive behaviour. I won't sort of talk about that building grade herd on the edge there because I'm out of time. What we do in the industry, so we manufacture and supply NATA-tested lime binder and hemp lime render. We're rated BAL 12.5 to BAL flame zone. That's been a slow and steady process. We're Group 1 fire rated for internal use in commercial settings, and that is really through the generosity of University of Tasmania, who paid for that fire testing in that instance. We partner with regional processors. That was always our model from 2000 when we were formed, is that we would regionalise and we would try and work with regional farmers, because that is when you lower the footprint. That's when you get within that 6 point whatever it is carbon equivalent kilos per square metre of building, is when it's actually not coming very far at all, because as we all know, it's a massive biomass. We've got freight, heavy freight associated with that. We're developing prefab solutions. We've R&D, I mentioned the work that we've done earlier. We have just been through testing a series of panels at UTS, working with UTS, New South Wales Uni and Sydney Uni, and looked at low carbon binders. Also, we very early on worked with a researcher from University of Lyon in France, a specialist in hempcrete, to make sure that our products were comparable with European products. We do offer education and training, so workshops for builders and owner builders. I've got a long background in education, and we also offered tailored workshops. So, for example, we worked with Woods Bagot, we worked with Public Realm Lab prior to those projects. We work with all stakeholders to make sure each building is a success, and that has meant that we probably haven't got as big as we could have gotten, but the construction industry is a really, really harsh industry for anybody who is familiar with it, and if we had bad buildings, we wouldn't get a look in. That is the reality, and that's another really important thing for the hemp industry to consider, that just because it's nice and fluffy and it stores carbon and works really well thermally, if there's a flaw in that, we'll be run out of town and we won't get a look in for several more years, and then someone will have to kind of climb their way back up there. So I guess as a company, our goal was to mainstream hemp construction, and to do that by really having quality builds and by pumping as much education as we could into the environment. We're a member of several organisations. We're actively involved in LCA work through MECLA, Materials Embodied Carbon Leadership Alliance. We're supporting development of a hemp traceability platform through Winton Evers' work. We're going to be reporting more than less, is I guess the last thing that I would say. And just really quickly, a few of our builds. I haven't shared any of the UTAS project. We've had 18 plus award-winning builds. The awards never go to us. They always go to either the builders or the designers. But that's still a wonderful thing, because it's all giving hemp credibility in the environment. So I actually missed the Shepherd's Ground, and I would like to go back just to shock everybody, including myself, one more time. This is Shepherd's Ground. That's a 120 square metre home. So when I gave that figure right at the beginning of where do we need to be, in the 1970s, big households lived in homes that size. That is actually the direction. that we need to be moving, the construction industry, and the hemp industry needs to be very clever about how it finds solutions that can do that, as well as get hemp building materials into the industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you.